name I pray. Amen.
Amen. You guys can be seated. Well, good morning. Good to see you, and so glad that you are here. If you've got a Bible, I want to go ahead and encourage you to be turning to 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19. We're going to wrap up that chapter together today. And a couple of quick announcements before I jump into that. Really, they're both related to Next Gen Ministries here at First Baptist. Kids Camp and Youth Camp, for the first time since I've been here, are going to be the exact same week. And so that may seem crazy, but we kind of like it right now. There's just some things with calendar and the camps that we go to. That's just the way that it fell this year, some things beyond our control. But here's what I want to tell you about that. If you have a child, camp for us is June 10th through the 13th. And we had, I think, about 55 spots. We have filled all of those spots. You say, Ben, why are you telling me this if I'm not on that list already? Because there's still a chance we may be able to get some more spots. But in order to do that, we need you to let Miss Megan, our kids minister, know this morning that you'd be interested in that. We can't guarantee that more spots will open up. But having worked in camp for a long time, what I do know is churches tend to sometimes overproject and then underbring, and so as those spots come open, we may have 4, 5, 6 more spots open up. But if you've got a child completed second grade through fifth grade, we'd love to try to at least make a way for them to go to camp with us this summer. But Miss Megan needs to know so she can put you on the waiting list. And if those spots open up, it will be first come, first serve, so you can't slip a 20 and get them in. But just if you'll let her know, she already has a few names, but you can let her know that. And then students completed 6th grade through 12th grade. Our camp is June 10th through the 15th down at Louisiana Christian University, or AKA Louisiana College. That's what I like to call it because I went there and they changed the name on me and I can't get it right. So, but we'll be at Cross Camp down there this summer, and there are about 25 spots left, I believe, or a little less than that. And you can see Wesley, and he can get you connected on that if you haven't already. And we'll be sharing those links again on Facebook for student camp. Kids camp, let Miss Megan know, and she'll get you on the waiting list, and hopefully some more spots will open up for that. So I think that's all the announcements. Joe's going to bring some more before he comes, or when he comes at the end to close. And so you'll want to hear some of those things. But kids camp, youth camp, June 10th through the 13th for kids, 10th through the 15th. We'll keep them a little bit longer, right? For students. So I want you to know that. Hey, today we're kind of wrapping up the story that we've been walking through in 1 Kings chapter 19 about the prophet Elijah. And I want to kind of remind you a little bit of what we've talked about. Elijah, of course, being this great prophet of God and having these incredible God moments in his life. The place that we jumped into his story, Elijah has gone literally from the mountaintop to the valley. He's done that physically, but he's also done it spiritually and emotionally. He's seen God work, and then he's panicking because of some things that have been said by a queen named Jezebel. And so the first week we talked about just how Elijah could go from this great moment on Mount Carmel where he sees God work and God deliver to Elijah being in the valley and panicking, God, where are you and what's it worth? And did my life even matter? Kind of being at the end of himself. And we saw God's faithfulness in that. And I told you that one of the things that we need to understand as the people of God is that God does not run from us in our brokenness, but he is so faithful to run to us. And so we walked through just that distraction and what causes us to be distracted. And then last week we came back and we looked at Elijah's journey from the valley up to Mount Horeb, and this interaction between him and God, where God begins to reshape and to refocus the heart of the prophet Elijah. And we talked a lot about perspective. That so many times all we can see is what's right in front of us. And we think, God, if I can't see it, you can't be doing it. And God says, oh boy, am I doing so much more than what you can dream and imagine? And even in the moments where it looks like I have quit, I have not stopped, you just can't see it yet. And he's encouraged Elijah about his plan, and we'll look at some of that together in a moment. And then today we're going to look at really kind of the end of the story there in verses 19 through 21 about another prophet named Elisha. Now, I want to go ahead and kind of give you the caveat. I'm going to mess those two names up, Elijah and Elisha. So I will at some point, I'll probably say the wrong name. Hopefully you'll follow along in your Bible and you'll know what I mean, right? Parents, you feel me on that? Like, just go with what I mean, not always what I say. So we'll try our best to do that. But here's what I want to talk about. I've given you a word every week. The first two were distracted and then perspective. Today I want to talk to you about going all in. Going all in. And hopefully this will make sense together in a few moments. Here's something I kind of think helps me understand it. How many of you know, and you don't have to raise your hand, but just think about this, that there's a difference between a fisherman and someone who likes to fish? Right? There's a difference between a fisherman and someone who likes to fish. I am a person who likes to fish. I used to think that the only rod and reel was a Zebco 33. And you could catch any fish in the world, because that's what my dad told me. And that you only had to have really one bait. Well, I guess three. There's three main baits, right? You could have some crickets on a hook and a bobber. You could have some worms. And then there was a black and yellow beetle spin that I used in every body of water I've ever been to. And really for most of my life, that was kind of the extent. Now, I knew that Walmart and other places sold, other baits, but man, growing up, if it didn't have a bobber and a hook or a black and yellow beetle spin, I just thought you just didn't know what you were doing. You fast forward, I get married, and Jen and I moved to a place called Leesville, Louisiana. And in our church there in Leesville, we had some friends that were not people who liked to fish. They were fishermen. And several of them were, I guess you'd say, semi-pro, but they were professional fishermen. I'm talking about the wrapped boat and the sponsors. And so what we did at our church is we had a youth fundraiser every month where we would have a bass club, and we'd go fish and raise a little money for the things that were going on. And I'll never forget the first time I showed up for one of these. We always paired people who like to fish with fishermen. And I got out of my truck, and I had my rod and reel and my little bitty tackle box, and I went up to my friend Chris, who I was going to fish with that day, and I went to get in his boat with my stuff, and he was like, "Hey, man, put your stuff back in the truck." I was like, "What are you talking about, man? These are new. Like, I bought some new stuff, and I got my rod, and I'm ready." And he said, No, put your stuff in the truck. Come here. So I put my stuff up, and I walked to this boat that probably cost more than my house at that point. And I walked up to this boat, and he opened up one side, and I looked in there. And man, there was probably 20 to 25 rod and reels just stacked, one on top of the other. Every one with a different bait and a different setup. And he walked me to the other side of the boat, and he opened it up, and it was all these different rods and reels and these baits. And that day, as I fished with Chris, I didn't make one decision. The only thing I had to do was stand on the front of the boat and cast and reel. He told me everything, provided everything. I don't even think he let my Powerade in the boat. I think I had to drink his. I mean, it was just, there's a difference, right, between those who like to fish and fishermen. A fisherman is somebody who's gone all in. They bought the boat. They know the right rods and reels. They check the water temperature, and nowadays they got the live scope and all those things, right? They're all in. They're fully committed. I'm just a guy who likes to fish, and so I bought what was on sale at Walmart. And I like to eat fish. That's really the best part of the story, right? That's all I really want to do. But there's a difference between those who like to fish and the fishermen. And the difference is the fisherman's gone all in. You say, Ben, what does that matter for us? Well, here's the deal. And I've been wrestling with this in my own heart, in my own life. So today, if you feel like, hey, are you talking to me? Just know I'm talking to me first, and you're kind of catching the overflow, right? But here's the reality. When it comes to following God, and as I'm walking through the scriptures this year, I'm learning this, that, man, when God calls someone, he never calls them half-heartedly. Not one time in the scriptures does God go to a man like Moses or Elijah or Abraham, or in the New Testament, the disciples or the Apostle Paul, does God go and call them to himself and then says, hey, just try this out and kind of go halfway and let's see what happens. Just kind of, if you'd give me some half of your heart, if you'd give me half of your attention. No, when God is calling men and women to himself, when God is calling us to, as we'll see in a moment, to specific things, God calls for us to go all in. And so this morning, as we read these scriptures together, we're looking at Elijah, and Elijah's been a man who's gone all in, and in that he has struggled and he has wrestled, and yet he has been seeing God's faithfulness over and over to him to restore him and to continue to send him. And now one of the things that God has told him that we're going to read about is God has told him, Elijah, you thought you were alone. You thought my plan was over. You thought you were the only one who loved me, but I've got over 7,000 men and women in Israel who are still mine, who have not bowed their knee to that false god Baal, who have not abandoned me. They're still mine. And not only that, Elijah, it's not just about the crowd. Elijah, I've got a plan that's been in motion even though you have not been able to see it. And when you leave Horeb, I'm going to send you to some men to anoint them as kings over 2 different kingdoms. And I'm going to use those kings to draw my people back to myself and to show them that I'm still here. But Elijah, one of the things I want you to do is to go to anoint your replacement. Elijah, I want you to go find the God. God doesn't just say, hey, Elijah, just whoever you think. Whoever you think will be good for this. He tells him specifically to go to a man named Elisha. And that's where we pick up in verse 19. Follow along with me. 1 Kings chapter 19, beginning in verse 19. Talking about Elijah, it says, "So he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him, and he cast his cloak upon him, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, 'Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you.' And he said to him, 'Go back again, for what have I done to you?' And he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and went after Elijah and assisted him." As you and I think about this call to go all in on what God is doing and what God is saying to us, here's the first thing that we see Elijah and Elisha kind of have together. Number one, you have to be able to recognize the call. You've got to be able to recognize the call. Elijah has left the mountain, and he's got all of this new information from God and all of these words and commands of God and things that he needs to go and to do. And what does Elijah do first? He just takes a step. He doesn't get overwhelmed by the to-do list and all the other things. He just goes and he seeks out and he finds Elisha. Now, I want you to notice that Elisha is not in the temple. Elisha is not in what we call the ministry. What is Elisha doing when Elijah finds him? He's plowing a field. He's got oxen and yoke, and he's getting the film ready. He's working on the farm, if you would, which tells us that Elisha is not necessarily looking for this moment. He's not anticipating that the prophet of God would come to him and call him to come and be a part of what God's doing. He's just working in the field. And he's overseeing some folks that are working there for his father, or we know for his dad, and Elisha's just going about his day. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this mundane opportunity of plowing the field, this prophet of God walks by and does something really strange. Or at least it's strange to us because we don't necessarily do and live this way. Elijah walks by and he doesn't say, "Hey man, are you Elisha?" He doesn't walk by and say, "Hey, I'm Elijah, the prophet of God, and I need to talk to you." He passes by Elisha, and he reaches around his shoulders, and he takes off his cloak, his outer garment, and he just throws it onto Elisha. Now, for us, that's like, that's a little weird. Can you imagine kind of on the escalator in the mall, or you're at the mall walking around, somebody walks past you, they just take their jacket off and just throws it on you? Like that, around here, that might get a fight started, right? So what's happening and what is going on? Well, the cloak for the prophet represents his own calling, his own ability to have seen God work and to hear from God. And so what Elijah is doing for Elisha is he's calling him. He's passing on what God has done in his own life and the work he's done in his own heart, and he's passing that on to Elisha. And he throws the cloak onto Elisha, and there's this call that begins to happen. But I also want you to notice that in order for Elijah to do that, where did he have to go? He had to get into the field. He had to give Elisha the call. This is not a general, like, who wants to come be the next prophet of God? It's not kind of like the Voice Hebrew edition. Like, this is Elijah seeking out Elisha. God didn't say, "Go find your replacement, Elijah." Elijah, go see who might be fit for this. Elijah, just do the best you can. He said, "Elijah, I want you to go find Elisha, the son of Shaphat, and anoint him, and then train him to do what you've done." It's not an all call. It's a direct appeal to Elisha. Now, why is that important? It's important because I think you and I often, when we think about the call of God, we kind of put that as a general thing. And other folks might be called to obedience, and other folks might be called to do something specific for God. Or even when it comes to salvation, that might be for someone else. But listen to me, when God speaks to his people, it's specific. It's a specific call. So if God calls you and you hear the gospel, there was a moment in your life where you heard the good news as a follower of Jesus, even as Cody prayed a moment ago, and you saw yourself for what you were, a sinner who needed saving by a God that you couldn't work your way back to. And so God made his way to you. And in order for you to see that and to believe that, what had to happen? You had to know that that message was not just for the world, but it was for you. It was a specific call. At some point you had to have heard, and it's not an audible, it's not like God sent you an email or a text message, but you felt, man, God is calling me to trust in Jesus. He's called my name. to be forgiven of my sins. He's called my name to know him and to walk with him. And it's a specific call. And here for Elijah has done that for Elisha on the behalf of God. Elisha, I want you to come follow me. Elisha, I want you to come be a part of what God is doing. The call here is for Elisha to come with Elijah. That's why you see Elijah's response. That he's going to run after Elijah and follow him. And again, I don't think Elisha was expecting this moment. But here's the reality. For you and I to recognize the call, we have to know that we don't necessarily cast cloaks anymore. But God has not stopped calling his people to obedience. God has not stopped calling his people to be with him and to follow him. He still comes to where we are and calls us into a different way of living or a different season of life. I mentioned this call to salvation, that God has called all of us, but it's a specific call to you. But there are also moments that God calls us to specific action. I think about the Apostle Paul. There's a moment in the book of Acts where he's wrestling with where to go and what to do, and he has a dream, and God says, no, I don't want you to go there. I want you to go and help over in Macedonia. And Paul has a specific call to go and to do something. And even in his own life, Jesus told him, I want you to plant churches and to share the gospel where it has not been heard and where it has not been believed. And so Paul gave his life to that. But I believe that same call that Paul had in sharing the gospel and planting churches, it was not because Paul was a preacher. It was because Paul was a follower of Jesus. And your call and my call have specific things, but the purpose in them is still for people to know him. And so there's calls to specific actions. There's calls to serve the least of these, and to love your neighbor. I think about one of the ministries that we partner with as a church is over in Shreveport. It's called The Hub. The founder is a girl named Cassie Hammond, and for over 17 years, Cassie had a calling that she didn't know what to do with, that she even refused. And yet, when she finally said yes, God has done some incredible things in the realm of delivering people from sex trafficking and from poverty and other issues in the city and in the area, really in the nation. God's used someone's obedience. And man, there's calls like that for all of us. The question is, do we recognize it? Would we know it? But you know what else I've learned in my life is that when sometimes that it's easy to kind of hear that and go, Ben, I don't think God's ever called me to anything. And I would say to you that, man, I'm so glad you're here this morning and that maybe you were thinking that, because I think without a doubt the call to salvation he has issued to you. Maybe you just haven't recognized it yet. Maybe today would be the day where you realize he's not calling the world, he's calling you. But I also think the same thing's true for some of you who've been Christians a long time. And you heard about this calling and you've heard about these moments and you're like, yeah, I think I know what it is, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not ready for that. I want to just ask you this question. It'll be on the screen. Man, what is it that God might be calling you to? Well, what is it for you? What step of obedience? And look, I told you before, it might be small. It might be large. The size of the call is not at question here. Right now, it's just, what is it? What is it that God might be asking? What is it that God might be calling you to? But you got to understand that just recognizing the call isn't the goal. Elisha in verse 20 doesn't hear this call from Elijah and just think to himself, man, I got a new cloak. Man, I'm glad winter was coming. I'm so glad I got this new cloak. And he doesn't run home to mom and dad and say, hey, look, the prophet signed it. Like, I got a new cloak that I can show my friends and show them. Elisha recognizes when the cloak falls upon his shoulders, Elisha recognizes exactly what's happening. How do you know that? Verse 20. He leaves the oxen and he runs after Elijah and he says to Elijah, let me go kiss my father and my mother and then I will follow you. Elisha knew in this moment what the call meant. And so he runs after Elijah and says, hey, I'm willing to go, but I need to go tell my parents goodbye. Why would he need to go tell his parents goodbye? Well, it's not just because their son's going to disappear for a day or two. He's going to tell them goodbye, and the text leads us to believe not just goodbye for a moment, but possibly forever. Elisha recognizes in the call of Elijah that he's going to leave everything that he's known, and he may not return. And so he tells Elijah, let me go tell them goodbye. Let me go tell them that I'm leaving. What is Elisha doing? If you're taking notes, number 2, he's counting the cost. We got to count the cost. And so he tells Elijah, let me go do this. Now Elijah's response, much like the throwing of the cloak, is a little strange to us. Elijah says to him, go back again. For what have I done to you? I mean, it's almost as if Elijah's saying, what are you talking about? Nothing happened. Almost as if Elijah is saying, look, there's no real big hook here. Like, I'm not asking for anything. But that's not what Elijah was doing. Elijah is asking Elisha, are you really ready to go? Elisha, are you really processing what I'm asking of you? Are you counting the cost? Are you really willing to leave everything? Do you understand what I'm asking? And I think Elisha's response tells us he understood. Let me go tell my family goodbye. But I want you to notice that Elisha didn't ask any other questions. Other than, let me go tell them goodbye. He doesn't ask for details. He has no idea where the journey is going to take him. He has no idea about all the things that are going to unfold. I mean, you and I have the privilege of where we can read some of this story and know that Elisha is going to have some God-sized moments just like Elijah. He's going to be a part of miracles and ministry and seeing people's hearts turn back to God. He's going to be the judgment, be used in the judgment of God against his enemies and so many other things. But Elisha in this moment doesn't know any of these things. All he knows is the prophet said, hey, come go with me. And he knows that he has to leave everything that he's ever known. That he's going to have to walk away from some things. No idea where he's going, but knowing that he's leaving the life that he knew. Church, if I'm honest with you this morning, and even if you're a guest here today, if I'm honest with you this morning, I think that this is where most of us struggle when it comes to following God. Specifically in the call to follow Jesus. We want to follow, right? I mean, we're in church. If I said, hey, do you want to follow Jesus? I mean, you're in church. Like, the good answer is, yeah. Yeah, I want to follow Jesus. I want all the good things that he's promised. I want to go to heaven when I die. But when it comes to actually following Jesus, most of us really only want that if it fits into our current schedule. If it won't take too much time and maybe it won't cost us too much in our social circles. Or for some of us, maybe we followed, but then things got difficult, and what do we do? I said it's not worth it. It's not worth it. It's too hard. One author has said that most of us have never really failed at anything. We just quit before we could finish it. And I think for a lot of folks, when it comes to following Jesus, that's exactly where we are. You see, somewhere along the way, this call to follow Jesus, this call to walk with God and to know God, we wanted to kind of soften it a little bit, right? So people read the words of Jesus or read the Old Testament scriptures and we think, well, man, that just sounds really, really hard. So surely there's like levels of following Jesus. And I think there are levels or maybe even seasons sometimes of intimacy with God. But understand, the call of God to his people from the beginning to now has never been, hey, if this fits in your schedule, would you mind doing it? Can you imagine God going to Moses, the burning bush, and Moses stops and walks over and God's like, hey, Moses, what are you doing for the next 40 years? Like, you got time to go rescue my people out of Egypt? I mean, if not, Moses, I got some other people and I'll figure some things out. And that's not what happened. God goes to Moses, and even when Moses is like, God, I can't do that. And he begins to list all of his reasons and excuses. Every time he gives a reason or excuse, God says, I've got you. I've got you. Moses finally says, hey, God, I just don't want to be the person that does that. And God's like, too bad, you're it. And I've already put people around you to help you get the job done. That story unfolds time and time again, because here's the reality, that when God calls a person, God's not depending on you to get it done. I told you last week, he's already at work. The invitation is not for his benefit, it's for yours. It's for you to position you in a place where you'll know the one who made you. You'll experience his faithfulness. You'll see that what you can see is not the end of all things. That there's more at work here, but you've got to count the cost. What is it to follow Jesus? What is it to follow God? And just in case anybody's like, well, that's an Old Testament thing. In the New Testament, when Jesus is talking to his disciples and explaining to them what it's going to be his disciple and what it takes, He once told them a story, or asked them a question. He said, guys, if you're going to build a tower, who sets out and just starts building it without first counting the cost and saying, do I have enough to finish it? Making sure I have the materials and all the things. Who doesn't at least examine, hey, am I willing to begin this process and see it through? And then Jesus tells them, this is what it's like to be my disciple. Don't just sign up for heaven when you die. When I call you, know that I'm calling for all of you. And somebody would say, well, that's not what he said. Well, you go to the end of chapter 14 of Luke, and this is what he said. If anyone does not renounce everything that they have, they cannot be my disciple. I'd love to soften that for you, but I can't. I can't, because Jesus is saying to follow me is to be all in. I think we need to recover some of this. We need to hold on to this reality of counting the cost and following through on what God's called us to. Because Elisha, in this moment, he says, I've got to go tell my family goodbye because this is something that I know that God is in and that God is doing. I want to lay everything on the table. So what's the question for us once we've recognized the call and begin to count the cost? Well, here's the second question. We got to ask, what needs to change for me? In order for me to walk in obedience, in order for me to be connected to what God is doing and to step into that, what needs to change? What do I need to give up or walk away from? What do I need to start doing that I haven't been doing? What is the cost of being obedient? But Elisha's story is not done because he's counted the cost. Look at verse 21. Number 3, Elisha he makes the decision to, number 3, burn the plows. Elisha hears the words of Elijah, go back again, what have I done to you? And Elisha goes back to his family, to his farm. He takes that yoke of oxen and he sacrifices them. And he burns the yoke that held them together, and he feeds the servants and the people there. Which again seems really odd, right? Like what in the world? Like there's no conversation. There's no Elijah giving him instructions. Elisha's just responding. But what is Elisha doing? I believe he's sealing the deal. He's taking a step that will allow him to walk fully into what God has. He goes back and he burns the plows and the oxen, and he feeds the oxen to his servants, and then he gathers up what little he has and he goes with Elijah. Here's what just happened. Elisha just said, Elijah, you are plan A. What God is calling me to is plan A. And just to make sure that everybody understands, I'm not leaving myself a plan B. I'm not leaving myself a place that I can return to. I'm all in for whatever lies ahead. Some would say that's foolishness. Elisha, you don't have any answers or any details. But you know what Elisha does know? And we're not told how he knows this, but what unfolds next, we absolutely know that Elisha knew this. Elisha knew that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was alive and well, that he had not abandoned his people. And so when this moment comes that Elisha feels the call of Elijah, Elisha jumps in. He doesn't have to know anything except God's in it. And God, if you're in it, I'm all in. I'm a part of this. I want to be a part of what you're doing. I want to be a part of what the future holds. No instructions from Elijah, but Elisha knew his own heart. He knew that he would be tempted to go back to the way things were. Some folks call that going back to the good old days, right? Elisha doesn't leave any good old days in the past. Doesn't mean he didn't love his family. Doesn't mean he didn't love the things he learned as a child. It just means that for Elisha, what God had called him to was the absolute most important thing for him. And he knew that if God called him to it, God was going to see it through. And he didn't want the weakness in his heart to draw him back to a place that he thought was better than what it was. I don't want to go back to the good old days. I mean, you and I, we kind of use that phrase from time to time, right? I want to go back to the good old days. I started thinking about some of the good old days today, and I found all kinds of things that were wrong with them. They weren't quite as good as what I remember. Now, there were some good memories, don't get me wrong. I had a good childhood and good parents and grandparents. I don't mean that at all. But just some of the things that the way the world was 40, 50 years ago, there are some simpler things that we need to recover. I am not talking about those. But, you go back too far and you lose running water. You go back too far and you're in the dark. You go back too far and you got to walk everywhere. I don't do that too well. But food and technology, all the things that sometimes we get overwhelmed by, some of those things are really good advancements. And And even in the idea of the good old days, there's some relationships and things that I think of. Man, I'm so glad that what I thought was true as an 8th grader, 9th grader, even into high school, that God, she's the one, or maybe for you, he's the one, and whatever. I'm so glad that God didn't say, yeah, that was the best it's going to get. You missed it, buddy boy. I'm so glad that God had a story that he was unfolding. And man, I don't have a part of me that wants to go back to those parts. Man, I want to make sure that when God calls me to it, man, I'm all in. God, I want to know what do I need to let go of and what do I need to move so that I can follow you. I want to put it all in your hands. That's what Elisha's doing. And what does that mean for us? I mean, chances are for you, you don't have any plows you need to go home and burn, and you need to kill your oxen or anything like that. But I do think that all of us have things that we find our security, our comfort, and even our hope in that sometimes become hindrances. There are things that we feel like we can manage and that can take up our time. Maybe for you, there are things that you just feel like, hey, I can't live without these things. Like I said, not all of those are bad, but maybe some of them are. You see, maybe for you, let's just be honest. For some folks in the room, it may not be things. It might be some relationships. It might be a job that you just think, hey, this is all it's ever going to be. And the way that you do that job is just routine and mundane. And you think, man, there's no way God could be in this. And maybe even right now, he's saying, hey, yeah, I'm in it. I just need you to know it. Like all of these things. Maybe for some of you, like I said, it's relationships. It's people. You know, one of the things I learned is I've been a pastor now I've been in ministry almost 23 years, but a pastor for the last 10. Here's what I know for sure. As a student minister, I often told youth and kids, hey, your friends matter. Hey, adults, can I tell you something that I know to be absolutely true about this room, that's true about every teenager or child room I've ever walked into? Your friends matter today as much as they mattered when you were a kid, if not more so. Your friends influence you. Your friends can get you to do things you never thought you would do. They influence you. And so here's the question in this call, and this idea of burning the plows. And I'm not telling you don't need to be friends with people who aren't following Jesus, but you need to make sure that your inner circle are people who are pushing you toward him and not pulling you away from him. And sometimes what has to happen is I've got to distance myself from folks who just don't get it when it comes to following him, who don't understand who God is and what he's called me to. And in order for us to step into what God has for us, we're going to have to sever ties with some things and maybe even some people. So here's my question for you this morning. I've asked you, what is God calling you to? What needs to change for you? And then here's the third one. Man, what do you need to let go of? What are the things, the relationships that, man, whatever your step of obedience, whatever it is that God might be calling you to, what are the things that cause you pause and to say, I can't take that step. I can't do this. Whatever's in that blank for you, whatever the this is something that, like Elisha, you need to burn the plows. You need to set yourself free from, allow God to be at work in those things. Because here's what I absolutely know to be true right now. If I could bring Elijah and Elisha, the Apostle Paul, Moses, Abraham, all of these people throughout Scripture who answered the call of God and who got it right and wrong, if you could bring them on stage right now and say, guys, was it worth it? Was it worth what you went through? Was it worth the struggle? Was it worth it? You know what every one of them would answer? Yes. Yes, it was worth it. When we got to experience the presence and the power of God in our lives, even when we got it right, or even when we got it wrong, we saw God work over and over. And here's why they would tell you that it's worth it. Because it really wasn't a matter of them going all in. It was understanding that God already had. That God had already gone all in for them. From the very beginning of time when man sinned and fell away from God, man, what did God do? He sent a rescuer. He sent a redeemer to pull us back to him and to make it possible for us to know him and to walk with him. But man, God's already gone all in. God didn't send an elected person to come and to try to figure things out. God sent the very Son of God to the earth to redeem us and to rescue us. And man, that's who our God is. His all in's already on the table. Now we've been called just to live in response to that. And so if God says, hey, you got to sever ties, you got to step out of that and step into this, just know that is absolutely what's best for you. Ben, how do you know? You're in a room full of people who can answer that question. There's a long line of folks who've lived in Sterlington and followed Jesus who can answer that question. How do you know? Because I've seen God show up over and over. The scriptures are full of men and women who over and over saw the faithfulness and the power of God because they recognized the call, they counted the cost, and they burned their plows to be a part of what he was doing. Church, it's time for us to go all in. Would you bow your heads with me? I don't know where you are this morning, but with nobody looking around, I want to give you just a second. Maybe to answer that very first question. What is God calling you to? What is it? Maybe this morning, maybe it's salvation. Man, you've never really put your faith in Jesus or never had a conversation with someone about what it could mean for you to follow Jesus and to receive what he's done for you. Man, we'd love to meet with you this morning and talk with you about that. I'd love for you to grab myself or Joe or Wesley or Cody, maybe even someone who invited you this morning. Say, hey, would you just help me understand? I believe God's calling me to take that step. Maybe your step this morning is something smaller. It's a conversation. It's an act of service. It's a prayer. You know, what's God calling you to? And then off of that, ask yourself those other questions. What needs to change and what do I need to let go of that I could go all in? Father, I pray right now that, God, you would help us. Father, so many of us, myself included, God, so many times we follow you half-heartedly. God, we want your call and your work to fit our schedules and our resources. But God, your plan and your work are so much bigger than that. And God, you're not concerned just with my life now, but you're concerned with eternity, the years ahead. And God, you have been so gracious and so kind to allow my story to intertwine with yours. That God, you would use my life to influence the life of my kids and my grandkids and my line. God, my friends and my circles. God, ways that I often forget. God, you've used men like Elijah and Elisha who were faithful so many hundreds of years ago. And God, their faithfulness has ripple effects into this room today because now we tell their story as men who knew you and walked with you. God, we learn from their lives and your work in them. God, may we be that for the next generation and those to come. God, would you help us to go all in, not to be hesitant, not to long for days that were, but God, to walk with you into the future and to what you're doing. God, whatever call we're wrestling with this morning, Father, I pray you would help us to answer it and to walk in obedience. God, there's nothing like being a part of what you're doing and knowing that you're going to see it through. Father, thank you for the ways that you are so good and kind and gracious to us. In Jesus' name, amen.